Hey all, welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. What I'm talking about today was actually a sermon that I gave at Solomon's Porch this last Sunday. Last week and over the next few weeks, I'm recording the sermons, our conversational, dialogical model of sermonizing at Solomon's Porch. We're talking about how to think about Jesus, and I think it matters a lot for framing a kind of spirituality for the 21st century that is beneficial for all of humanity. And I think there's some things about Jesus and Jesus' teachings that are essential to that. And to me, to my mind, how we think about Jesus becomes very important for us to engage with any of the teachings and thoughts and ways of Jesus. So the sermon today is Jesus as an exemplar, the example. And I take on the passage that is so famous to a lot of us where from the Gospel of John, where Jesus is quoted as saying to his disciples, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one gets to the Father except through me." And it's my suggestion that this was always meant to be understood as an inclusive comment, as in all who get to God get there the same way, and we should all join in that way. So let's not separate ourselves out from one another. We're all along the same way as we get to God. And so anyway, I guess that's it. You can stop listening now, or you can listen to the 30-minute sermon and followed by the discussion from Solomon's Porch this last week. So hope you enjoy. Sermons this summer are going to be soapbox sermons around what's often referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. There's a sign-up list there. I think there are 6 or 7 slots left. 2 10-minute sermons a week. So if you want to do one of those, please sign up. I'd love to have you do one. And in preparation for that and conversation about that, I wanted to do a few weeks talking about Jesus. As I mentioned last week, and we record these sermons, we're going to record them this May and for next, all through the summer. So if you missed some and want to catch up, we'll put those in the email and all. But last week I mentioned that Jesus is a very important figure in my spirituality and life and faith and all of that. And I realize that there's a lot of ways to think about Jesus. One of the ways that people like to think about Jesus is as a movement leader, like we talked about last week. Today I'd like to talk about Jesus as an exemplar, the way of humanity, showing a way for humanity. Other people like to think of Jesus as a savior. I like that one. We'll talk about that next week. And Jesus as a teacher, a moral, philosophical, religious teacher. And I think all of these really matter, and they're all significant. Today we're going to talk about this idea of Jesus as the exemplar, the example for humanity, the one that would show the way that humanity ought to live. This is a really big theological question. You might not think about it a lot or struggle with it, but people who think about theology have thought about it for a lot of years. If you go to churches that have a time where they read some of the doctrines or creeds of the church, they're often trying to answer the question about how do you think about God, humanity, and specifically Jesus in the Christian tradition. And some of those are working really hard to either put a lot of emphasis on Jesus as a human example or to suggest that Jesus can't really be a human example because there's something different about Jesus that would allow Jesus to access God and to do things in the world that make that out of reach, out of touch for humanity. I'll just say right off the start here that I think that the point of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John specifically, and even some of the other, what are referred to as the Gnostic Gospels, are trying to implore humanity to actually do the things Jesus does. I don't think Jesus is described in the Gospels in a separate, distinct, far away from the human capacity way. I think it's just the opposite of that. So that's what you're going to get out of me today, and we'll talk about it a little bit in the conversation afterward. Sometimes I refer to this, and other people do too, as the agenda of Jesus for humanity, or the desire Jesus has for humanity, or the belief that Jesus has of humanity, or the call of Jesus for humanity, or the dream of Jesus for humanity, the hope for humanity. Today I want to talk about it as the way of Jesus for humanity. Now, this idea that Jesus is one who proclaims that there is a way and you ought to walk in it is a really big part of the early Christian tradition. You might know that as we've read through the book of Acts, which tells the story of the early days, one of the storylines of the early days of Christianity. Christianity was referred to as the way. That Christianity's early way of being understood was as a way of life, a way of being. We've tended to get away from that in different times of the Christian tradition and different times of our lives. And I get that. There's a lot of reasons why you would. Sometimes finding your way is a difficult thing. And there's reasons why we might put emphasis on others. But Jesus' notion to follow me is, I think, at the center of understanding any way of thinking of Jesus. Jesus' call to humanity is not to change. It's not even to believe. It is to follow. That notion, come and follow me, live in this way, be like this, engage with others in this kind of capacity, that's at the heart of the whole thing. Like, the center of it all is follow me along this way. Now, the question about what that way is becomes its own kind of complication, right? The sense of, well, does that mean a way of thinking? Does that mean a way of believing? Does that mean a way of acting? Does that mean a way of understanding? I actually think it involves all of those. But we'll talk a bit about that today. John 14 is probably one of the most famous sections for this whole the way business. John 14 has this particular section that has been very helpful to some and really disturbing to others. Does anyone know what I'm referring to in this John 14 around this? What's that?
The leave others behind follow.
Not that one? Yeah, but that. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And no one gets to the Father except by me. That line, super famous. I am not sure what the first phrases of Jesus I was taught when I got into Christianity as a 16-year-old in 1983. But if that wasn't one of the first lines, it was a close second. Like, it was really, really important to the people that I was hanging around with and who introduced me to faith to understand Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one gets to the Father except by me. That's in the translation of the Bible that I read, the New American Standard Version and then the New International Version, and its most common phrasing in most translations. Really popular phrase. And it's been really powerful for an awful lot of people. There's a lot to say about that. One caveat, and then I want to agendize on you for a minute about a way to think about this. The caveat is, what Jesus was probably referring to, if Jesus said something that was parallel to this, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, right? So the gospel writers collect together Jesus' sayings and use them in certain ways. So when Jesus would have said something about the way, the truth, and the life, probably, chances are, most likely, he was doing a remix of how the Jewish community of his day, the burgeoning Jewish community, would have thought about Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and then the teaching that followed. It was referred to as the way, the truth, and life, and sometimes the light. Very common phrase. I'm not going to get too much into this today, just a little bit. But Jesus' use of I am the way, the truth, and the life was to dislodge that from being some inarguable authority of Scripture and putting it into an expression of a human. The humanization of the way, the truth, and the life in and of itself was such a progressively radical idea. For us, we may hear I'm the way, the truth, and the life as some restrictive narrative, but in the first century, to someone where in the places where Jesus lived or where his teachings were taught, for someone to say the way, the truth, and the life, that's me and not Torah, that was a radical statement. So to us, it can feel like that's a constricting statement, but the use of it was, that's me. It would be like the presidents of the United States saying something like, I am the Constitution. If I say it, that makes it so. We'd be like, whoa, no, you're not the Constitution. We have this written document that's the Constitution. We all interpret that Constitution, and then we're going to live by it, and that's the oath you take as a president, but you don't get to say, I am the Constitution. That sort of undermines the very notion of the Constitution. When Jesus uses a phrase like, I am the way, the truth, and the life, people were freaking out about that. He also, that phrase, and this one comes from the Gospel of John, There are 7 times where Jesus uses an I am phrase. In fact, the Gospel of John is organized around 7 miraculous signs and 7 I am statements. Well, let's do a little pop quiz. Maybe you know a few of these. If you know any of the times where Jesus said, I am a this or I am a that, they come from the Gospel of John. So any of those that are in your head. Anybody think of any of those I ams right off the bat? Yeah. I'm the good shepherd. I am the vine. I'm the bread of life. I'm the branches. I'm the light. Is that what you said? I'm the light. All of those are phrases that Jews would have used either for God specifically or for Torah. So when Jesus takes those, he's doing something to say, let's not form a way of being that's around some written document, no matter how powerful it is, pull it in and make it a part of humanity. Okay, so here's John 14. Somebody wants to be a reader, you can read this bit. And then I want to take us through a particular way of thinking about this, reading it, saying it, that gets at this notion that there's a way of life and a way of being. Because for most of us, the invitation for spirituality is to join into a way. This summer with soapbox sermons, any of the other stuff we do in here, if you understand that the invitation of blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will see God. This kind of statement is an invitation to a way of living and being. For some of us, our way of living and being is what we do in our bodies. For some of us, it's what we do in our spirits. For some of us, it's what we do in our mind and our thinking. We are complex beings as human beings. And all of those, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the intellectual, they're all us, right? That's the whole thing. And so some of us are more easily able to follow in an intellectual way, for some of us more in a body way, for some of us more in a moral or emotional way. It's all great and important. The encouragement is to extend the way into all the areas of your life. So if you start out as an intellectual person, to root that in your body. If you started as a body person, to also include that in your morality. If you start as a morality person, to also root that in your way of thinking, so that you become someone who is a part of the way. So Jesus does this thing. I think it's so provocative, and the way many of us will hear it read as it's put out in many translations of John 14, it uses words and phrases that seem binary, that were not meant to be binary. So I want to take us through a way of reading this. All right, so here it is, John 14. I think it's 3 slides long, so anybody can read any or all the slides if you want.
Don't be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. My Father's house has room to spare. If that weren't the case, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When I go to prepare a place for you, I'll return and take you to be with me, so that where I am, you will be too. You know the way to the place I'm going.
Right, so he's already launching into this sort of way business, and this whole idea of trusting God and trust also in me. Like, if you grant Jesus a lot of godness, that's a comfortable statement. If I say that to you, that gets a little on the edge of creepy, right? Hey, people of Solomon's Porch, trust God. Trust also in me. Don't make a distinction between those. Where God is, I am. We're all in this thing together. I am in the Father's in me, and I am in you, and believe me. You see how that starts to feel odd? This is why Christianity's done some things to make Jesus more like God and less like us. It's been one of the arguments. Okay, so this whole thing about you know the way of the place where I'm going. And we're in a whole narrative here. So that whole don't be troubled. Jesus just said, I'm about to die, right? If you know the Gospel of John structure, the Gospel of John structure is, Jesus just said, they're going to kill me, and that doesn't put an end to this story we're in. So don't be troubled at the end of my life. The end of my life is not the end of this story. That's what he's getting at. So it goes on. So Jesus says this, you know the way to the place where I'm going. And then,
Thomas asked, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you have really known me, you will also know the Father. From now on, you know him and have seen him.
All right, so there it is. There's the killer. Like, for some people, when they read it in context, they're like, "Wow, it's kind of different than the way it would get pitched when it's just pulled out on its own, right?" If someone just in the middle of a conversation says, "Well, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one gets to the Father except by me," so that means Jews, non-Christians, whatever, blah, 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 right? Feels really different than Jesus saying, "Look, you know the way to the place where I'm going." And Thomas said, "We don't even know where you're going. How could we know the way?" And Jesus says, "Well, I am the way." That's in a whole conversation about the place I'm going. It's not a conversation about the ontological nature of Jesus. But then he does this little tie-in. Jesus is used in John of God. He doesn't use God only. He also uses this notion of the name of the phrase of a father, the patriarch of a family. "Except through me, you have really known me. You also know the Father because now you've seen him because you've seen me." This is where it really ramps up. And then Philip chimes in.
Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father. That will be enough for us." Jesus replied, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been with you all this time? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I have spoken to you, I don't speak on my own. The Father who dwells in me does his works."
Right? You can see how it starts to ramp up. And he goes on with this.
Trust me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on account of the works themselves. I assure you that whoever believes in me will do the works that I do. They will do even greater works than these because I am going to the Father.
So, believe me that if I'm in the Father's in me. And if you don't believe me, at least believe the works. In fact, the works that I do, those who believe in me, they're going to do the same works and even greater works than these. Now, I've spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about this because I just wrote a book called Greater Than. And the subtitle is How Ordinary People Are Outdoing Jesus and Why It's Good News. Because I think Jesus' point is those who live in this way, they will do those works and they'll do even greater works than these because I'm leaving the system and going back. I'm leaving the flow and going back to God. And when that happens, it opens the story even more broadly. Okay, I think this story could be read something like this. I think here's a way to read it, pun intended. Thank you very much. I really hope for more out of that, but I'll take it. I might want to say this is the way to read it, and then you get it all. All right, so here's a version of it. I think it gets at the same thing and is saying what Jesus is getting at here, but without the strange Greek and English use of this no one gets to as a way to say everyone gets there the same way. Right? There's a couple ways you could say something like everyone, and that's to say, to use it to put it in the phrase of a negative. No one doesn't. Everyone does. That's what Jesus, I think, is doing. So I think here's a way to read it. The same sort of passage starting from the beginning. There's a way of life. It is the way of God, and it is my way, Jesus says to them. There is always, that's not a pun, that's just a typo. There's always room on this way. There is a place for each of you. This is not an exclusive way only for some. It is the way for all. The way I have been taking is the way you too can take. So follow me. So Thomas asked, but we don't know the end, the destination. How could we know the way? I am the way, Jesus says. The way is not a means. It is the end. I am the truth too. Truth is not abstract. It is a person. The way is not abstract either. The same goes with life. It is along this way that we all find God. This is true for all of us. We live in the way of God. What you see in me on this way, that is seeing God. So Philip then begged, show us God, and that is what we need and want. And Jesus replied, But Philip, after all this time you've spent with me, seeing the way of God, you have been seeing God all along. In the way I have been living and in the works I have been doing. God is in me. God is in the works. God is the way. This is why I say God is in me and I am in God. We are inseparable. And you too, when you live in this way, will be living the same way. In fact, you will do what I do and do even greater works than these. This is how the way is. It always opens up wider and broader as people join the way. So follow me. Come on the way. Jesus says the exemplar is not just understanding Jesus in some well, I wonder what Jesus did and how could I replicate that. It is an exemplar saying there is a way of God and it's a path, but that path is shaped and made as we take it, as we go. It widens and widens. That's why I think the key to that whole thing for Jesus is that it's greater than, it widens the path. If Jesus' point was things were really good at one point in humanity, in this previous time in the Garden of Eden, then got really bad. Now things are really good for a little while. They're going to get really bad again, and then you're going to get out of this and get to heaven when things are good. You wouldn't talk like this. But if what Jesus is saying is all along, show people the way, invite them the way, live in the way, be about this way. This is why for Christianity, the way people live is so important. Not because it's some sort of moral demand that God determines if you're good or not and get to go to the good place or not the good place. There's so much more at stake than that. It is actually about the whole way being opened up for people. That video that we saw before the sermon about the man in Palestine and interacting with people in Israel, that's what it's getting at. That kind of thing, the thing we talked about in the anti-racism training, the identity politics, the way of living and being, this is the shaping of a people to live in a particular way. So when you look at the life of Jesus, it's not a one-off here and a one-off there. It's an entire invitation to follow in the very way of God, and that's where God is found. This is what every spiritual teacher of every tradition, and especially Jesus, wants to say is, you don't take a path to get to God. You take the path to walk with God. That's the storyline. So I think Jesus as the exemplar, or Jesus as the way that humanity ought to be, is this totally wide open pathway that invites people to join in on it, and then they become part of shaping and making that very way, which makes all of us indispensable and inseparable from God and from the way. So you're not just, and that's why I think it uses Thomas and Philip as these pivot points to turn the story. We don't know the way. You're on it already. Just show us God. This is finding God. That's the storyline that Jesus unfolded. This is what made him so provocative in the first century, and I think so provocative in the 21st century. Okay, thoughts, comments, interactions, conversations about all this.
Can you speak a little more to the second part of that? No one comes to the Father but through me.
Oh, I certainly can speak more about it. Yeah. So I think what Jesus is saying there is, like the way I phrased it. I think in this particular reading is, I am the way. The way is not a means; it's the end. I'm the truth. The truth is not abstract; it's a person. The way is not abstract either. The way goes. The same way goes with life. It's along the way that we find God. This is true for all of us. So I would. To go back into the more traditional way of reading this passage, where Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except by me. I think one simple little way to change that language, I think, to be more clear as to what Jesus was getting at, instead of saying, what would be Jesus saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and all who get to God get there that same way. The way, the truth, and the life that I'm a part of is the same one that everyone who connects with God takes. That's the open way. The problem we have is that Jesus' use of I am. It's the personal pronoun nature of that we think now becomes restrictive. But I think what Jesus is saying is, What I am about, the way, truth, and life that I'm about, that's the one that all people are about with God. And God's not being picky about this. All who get to God in the same way. And that's the way that we're on. But the way that the Greek lays it out, it has this, I don't nerd out on Greek verb tenses, but you could interpret it as no one gets there except this way, or you could say all who get there this way. The language allows this sort of choice.
So it's not about him, but it's about his way.
It's not about him, it's about the way.
Personal.
And what Jesus is trying to say, and that's why that whole thing in John starts out with believe in God and believe also in me. These two things I want you to see as inseparable. Not because I think I'm God, but because what I'm trying to say is what I'm about is the thing that God is about. So I am no more exclusive than God is exclusive. And that's what I think is going on. Yeah, absolutely.
Would you say that Jesus is saying something like, everyone who gets to God gets there through my way? Everyone who gets to God gets there through my way, whether they know it's my way or not, or whether they know or claim it's in the name of Jesus or not. It's more about the fruit of that way, or the connecting with God, and less about knowing that it's being conscious that it's having had the privilege of learning all this about Jesus' life and consciously trying to exemplify him.
I actually, yes, but I would nuance it like this. What Jesus is saying to these people, and this is why Philip and Thomas become important, and this is a response specifically to Thomas, is to say, the way that I am with God is the same way you will be with God. All of us are the same. I think his sort of there's no other way isn't Jesus saying, I'm it and everybody else is wrong. He's saying, the way that I am, that's the same way for all of you. It's the same for all of us. I think it's a same for all of us statement that he's making, not a keep those people out kind of statement. So what he's actually getting at here is, don't set me apart as if now we're going to get to God. You're going to take us to God. He's like, this way that I am, these works that I'm doing, this life that we're leading, this is the life of God. And that's the same one you should be on. Join me in it. I think that's the language he's using. I think Jesus is, this is going to sound strange for some people. Some want to think about it a few times before they take it on as their own thought. Jesus is trying to get rid of the exceptionalism that the Gospel of John thinks that people are starting to form around Jesus. He's not in this passage extending the exceptionalism. He's trying to get rid of it. He's trying to say, the way that I'm on, that's the way that's open for all. So if you see God in me, which I hope you do, that's the same way you should be, is in that same way. And the way is what I invite you to. So don't think that I have some inside track and you guys have to take this other track and I'm going to show you and declare God to you. Come with me and experience God. That's why his comment to Philip and to Thomas are so important. That or what he says to Philip, I've been showing you God all along. This is the way. Join in it. It's almost like the eyes have to open so that people can understand that God, there's not some treasure of God that's been hidden on the hill. That's why the I am is so powerful in that. I think. Yeah.
I'm thinking of two things. One thing that you said in the past that's taken me a little while to absorb is God is not a single, separate other subject.
Yeah.
Something like that, is that the right quote?
Don't think about God as a separate single subject.
Yeah. And then, so thinking of that, and then notions of in yoga or Eastern meditation thoughts, there's a meditation called So Hum. And that meditation, you just meditate on those words, and they mean I am, or that I am. And I think, again, it's like thinking about God as other than and out there versus God as within and embodying all.
Yeah, that's
a really powerful, huge shift.
Yeah, and the Hebrew thought around that same I am, that's the only name given for God when Moses says to God, what do I tell the people for them to believe me that you've spoken to me on this mountain? And the response is, tell them I am. So the name of God becomes the name of I am, which is why when Jesus says I am the way, the truth, and life, it's really ratcheting up a conversation about inside of that tradition. And that's what makes this so powerful when Jesus says to the people here, the work that I'm doing is the work that you're going to be doing. In fact, you'll do even greater works than these, is greater I aming. It's, yeah, then we'll be done.
I also think that, just to be saying that, the notion of the Holy Spirit or the Trinity, those things are kind of all out there separate from us. And it's taken a long time for me to feel and sense that the Holy Spirit is other than and then coming to me. And it is me.
Yeah.
And I think that is also where it's like what's ego and all these other things come into play. But recognizing that I am is this larger and broader and bigger God sense in all.
Yeah. And Jesus does a riff on the Hebrew blessing that God is the light of the world and the salt of the earth. And it says, and you are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. So, anyway, trust in God, trust also in me, Jesus said.